Great, Anna, and it looks like we've got most folks in the room. So if you want to go ahead and start.
I will. Hello, everyone. We're glad you're here for Francesca Capone's talk, hosted by myself, Annan Barrett. I'm PSU adjunct faculty, and also Allison Hurrier, who's behind the scenes here, letting you all in. She is the Sue Horn-Caskey and Charles F. Caskey Professor of Textile Arts and Costume Design here at Portland State. This talk is part of the PSU Textile Arts Program Spring Lecture Series. There are 3 more free public events coming up on Eventbrite, and you can find them listed on a brand new website, which just debuted today. It's psutextilearts.com, and that'll be in the chat as well. So check it out. I want to acknowledge also that we are coming to you from land where Multnomah, Cathlamet, Kalapuya, Clackamas, Malala, Chinook, Tualatin, and other people live and have lived for many generations, and whose culture was extirpated through genocide, relocation, and assimilation in ways that continue to this day. It's important to recognize that our experience now is the result of these lived histories and to honor and reckon with their legacy. It's my privilege to introduce our guest speaker today, Francesca Capone, who is a visual artist, a writer, and a materials designer. Her work is primarily concerned with the creation of materials and a poetic consideration of their meaning. She is interested in how tactile forms simultaneously serve as functional surfaces for daily life and as a mode of communication or symbol within the cultural paradigm. She exhibits her work internationally as well as at National Gallery here in Portland. Her books examine the poetics of textiles with intriguing titles like Weaving Language 2 and Writing in Threads. As she talks, please put your questions, comments in the chat, and we'll save 10 minutes at the end of the hour for Allison and I to field those questions, and we'll ask Francesca to discuss them. So again, please put your questions or comments in the chat as you get ideas. So Francesca, welcome to our lecture series. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me and for that lovely introduction, Annan. Thank you for including this lecture as part of your course, and to Allison Hurrier and the organizers of the PSU Textile Arts Program Lecture Series. I'm so delighted to be included, and thank you to everyone who's attended. I'm just going to start with a short video. Let's see if this works. Nope. Nope. So I like to begin by just addressing my occupation. So as Annan mentioned, I'm an artist, a materials designer, a writer, and an educator. So how is it possible to be all 4 things? So just sort of a note on interdisciplinary work and thinking. And this is also sort of my approach to creation. So at the beginning of my career about a decade ago, I committed to pursuing all of these interests, and I couldn't quite visualize how they would fit together. And I had heard of this expression, parallel practices. So this idea that perhaps you have a day job, but you're moonlighting or some kind of arrangement like that. And these two things maybe inform one another, or perhaps they exist, one for economy and one for life's work. But I felt that I had too many interests to fit into the hours in the day and couldn't figure out how to fit them into one practice. So I couldn't fathom how could I be art making, writing, designing, teaching, all simultaneously, and be engaging with these practices with any kind of depth, right? Because you also want to have like a meaningful practice into these ideas. So how could I possibly begin when honing a craft takes time, focus, and commitment? So my approach to my occupation is through braiding. And so this is a rotation of focuses where one takes precedence at a time and the pattern repeats, and perhaps not in an exact order or perhaps not in an evenly weighted way, but in a cumulative way. And it's taken me 10 years, but slowly over time, I've had the opportunity to publish books, exhibit over multiple continents, be a practicing materials designer at various firms, and then also run workshops and give lectures at different academic institutions. And of course, this has all been established over a long period of time with various rotations of focus. And I say this to encourage students or anyone embarking at the beginning of their career or perhaps on a new multidisciplinary path, as I've felt discouraged before because it's a really slow way of working, and it takes time to gain traction and relevance. So patience and endurance are necessary. Today, I'm going to focus on the books that Anand mentions, this project that has taken much braiding and endurance over time and has really involved all the aspects of the practices I mentioned, teaching, writing, weaving, textile and textile design and art making. And this project is called Weaving Language. And there have been many editions over the course of the past 9 years, from 2012 to now. So I'll take you through sort of the whole string of the work, and we'll go through in sequence for how I focused on them over time. But you can see here sort of the way that it's flowed. So the first book was Weaving Language Lexicon, and that then influenced the sort of a water flow or a waterfall of projects where I realized that it wasn't quite possible. I was never sort of done with it, and I'm still not. So Weaving One Lexicon started in 2012, and now in 2021, thanks to the support of the Oregon Arts Commission and the Ford Family Foundation, there'll be a new trade edition of this book. So I'm very excited about that, and that's sort of the most recent iteration of this work. So there are many versions of this project, and it's evolved over time and existed within the context of collaborations, exhibitions, lectures, readings, as well as the book form, all of which I'll kind of go through. And while researching the intersection of weaving and writing, I discovered that there were many disparate references, but never one that fully captured my interests. And I began compiling and categorizing information on this subject as a way to contribute to the academic and creative canons and creative weaving language, to draw attention to the critical mass of existing work at the intersection of text and textile that predates even our earliest writing systems, through cataloging it and designing prompts for readerly and weaverly exploration, and creating contemporary dialogue with various writers and weavers and textile makers. So how did I come to explore this space between the forms of weaving and writing? As it is, weaving has its own notation system that weavers use to draft up potential woven designs on the hand loom, as well as for programming peg or computer-based Dobby systems, as well as jacquard looms. So in that video in the beginning, I was working on a peg loom. So there was no treadling because the peg, or there was only one treadle because the peg was rotating along with the weaving. And learning woven drafting at the Rhode Island School of Design in 2006 was my first exploration into what a woven language might be. So this, of course, document that I have on the screen here isn't my personal woven draft. It's sort of an ancient one that I found in a book that I just thought was beautiful. And of course, I'm not the first artist who has delved deeply into the intersection of text and textile. Artists such as Ani Albers, this is some of her studies, both in typography and textile. Cecilia Vacuna, also who works back and forth between typography and textile. And Jen Bervin have all been guiding forces into my discoveries in this space. Immediately after studying at RISD, a period as a studio assistant to Jen Bervin blew open my understanding of this intersection at an early point in my career. These are some of my early explorations in studying intersection of text and textile. In the words of Emmett Williams, the poem as picture is as old as the hills or the men who once lived in them, scratching their histories and fantasies in preliterate strokes on the walls of caves. And it was the success that our ancestors had in achieving materiality with language that launched me onto the trajectory of the Weaving Language Project. Language is a material that transcends all forms of media. There was also the issue of time, which I mentioned a moment ago. Juggling my work as a textile designer and educator while also pursuing my visual art practice and writing practice felt overwhelming and impossible as separate pursuits, compelling me to work in a singular direction and to begin exploring ways to braid it all together. This was another early study in doing so, which quotes Annie Albers in a jacquard cloth. So my early inspiration for weaving language came to me while studying these two books in 2012 during a residency at the Haystack Mountain School of Crafts in Deer Isle, Maine. Admiring Annie Albers' capacity to catalog all the various structures and qualities of weaving, as well as Emmett Williams' work in cataloging and translating a global movement in concrete poetry, I wondered if one could translate the properties of weaving into English with a similar approach. So as you can see on the right, there's a translation from German by Emmett Williams, and he includes this tower of equal signs that translates just a few words in German, so that when you look at the poem, which is inherently visual, you can't really take that poem because the poetics exist within the German language. So you really need to understand German in order to visually understand the poem. So you quickly learn a few words in German, and then you look at the poem and the whole thing unlocks. So then looking at Annie Albers' work, I wondered, well, is it possible for me to take this catalog and translate each thing into English and into English grammar? So that was exactly what I tasked myself with doing. So this is an early edition of Weaving Language 1 Lexicon from 2012, which I self-published in an edition of 100. So the work directly references Emmett Williams' translation technique, and I mapped the properties of it onto English grammar, which I'll delve into in a few more slides. But as you can see, I sort of likened all the foundational aspects of weaving into the foundational aspects of grammar in a one-to-one form, so that a reader could potentially take a woven cloth and translate it and unlock a message. This is a more recent expanded edition of Weaving Language 1 Lexicon from 2015, which I published as an artist book edition of 5. And as I mentioned, is going to come out in 2021. So in Weaving Language 1 Lexicon, processes are juxtaposed with English grammar to suggest a method for reading woven works. And it offers both visual vocabularies as discrete concrete poems, as well as a collection of translatable terms. And this book invites readers, weavers, and writers to participate by considering weaving as a form that may be read and perhaps translated. And I would say that the whole Weaving Language series does the same thing. It sort of serves as a prompt to invite the reader to consider textile form as written form. So I'm very excited because the expanded edition of the lexicon that comes out in 2021 will feature the work of a collective of artists expanding upon each section. So all 4 of these sections will have a collective of artists against them who will sort of produce work inspired by the idea of translation of each portion. So in the creation of this book, each book has a sort of form that it takes, and some of the forms are made up, and this one is sort of made up by me, or not really by me, just sort of dubbed. So I've dubbed this form weave writing. So that involves extracting word from weave, extrapolating material from material, acknowledging that there's a code embedded in a surface, and passages can be revealed through the process of making. And this exact term or terminology is referred to in the introduction to the book. So again, it is an invitation to writers and weavers and artists alike to kind of consider textile as a language form. So I'll just read to you the last bit. I invent an imperfect language built from languages. As any, no perfect language. The system fails as all systems fail, but where systems fail, possibilities arise. This makes complications, and complications can be interesting. Imagined ellipses at the foot of each page, space for text to step into or a notation to embroider, ligature or thread form. Woven structure repeats, writing repeats, taken apart and sewn together, editing a poem, embellishing the substrate of empty cloth/page, meaning left open, sentence structure rearranged, arranging word pieces with a mind to enter the weaving, roped in. Every row of weaving packed down with the batten, another line of written language. This is that same tower of equal signs that I mentioned in the 2015 edition. As you see, the typeface also changed. So this is when I was saying I would delve a little bit deeper. This is what the inside of the book, or that earlier draft of this book or edition looks like. So fiber indicating pronoun or subject. So the animal, and this is entirely based on personal perception and personal interpretation. So I thought that the animal fiber was closest to the first person pronoun. It's the very thing of the cloth. And so I or we made sense because humans have hair, just the way that goats and sheep have hair. So that's sort of the way I thought about it, was likening animal and human into sort of this first person. And then plant fibers as secondary to that, being second person, and then synthetic fibers being tertiary to that, being third person. That was my 2015 interpretation. And I'm excited to see what the artist who's interpreted this section for 2021 does with it. So then the weave structure represents the verb. So plain weave, in my opinion, looked like an incredibly balanced cloth. So I translated that into balance. And again, the reason why weave structure is verb is because the weave structure is an action and a verb is an action. So that felt like the way that a weave structure comes to life, as you saw in the video in the beginning, involves a lot of movement. And so that felt to me most appropriate to be represented by a verb. And then each sort of translation is its own discrete visual poem. So basket weave is to contain, long ribs is to grow, cross ribs to swim. I won't go through every single one. Then this part is uses Ani Albers, with the permission of the Albers Foundation, uses Ani Albers' original diagrams to reference the interlacings and translate the interlacings. So the preposition links nouns, pronouns, and phrases. So the idea of having interlacings, which is something that is linking threads, felt like a perfect one-to-one translation. Like it all kind of fell into place in my mind with perfect logic. So this takes all of Ani Albers' translations or catalog of interlacings and translates them. So looping is along, twisted looping is during, twining is across, netting is about. Just a few examples. So in 2014, I did a residency at the Ani Albers Foundation and had the opportunity to really take my time with thinking about color. And I took the whole, and translating color into language. So I took the whole dictionary and parsed it for words, and then also used some of my own books. But I think just parsing the dictionary gave me this great catalog to move through. And I did it, it's a very personal exercise, but looking at all of the words and what color comes to mind. And I sort of gave myself a basic grouping of colors, like Roy G. Biv, basically, and translated them into different colors in language. So what would this colored thread mean? And the color represents nouns and adjectives because they're really the descriptive part of the weaving in so many ways. So a few of the red words: earthen, anthem, furnace, thrain, ved, artery, heart, vein, artery, heartbeat, second. And some yellow words: turmeric, exaltation, dandelion, bale, obscene, turpentine, triangle, uplifting, vector, abdominal. So I'm going to skip to Weaving Language 3 because it has a direct relationship. They all have a relationship, but it has a very direct relationship to Weaving Language 1. And then I'll end on Weaving Language 2 as it's the most recent edition to be published in a trade edition. So the expanded edition of Weaving Language 3 came, Writing in Threads came in 2015 as an artist book edition of 5. And as you can see, it involved a group of artists in collaboration. And then there was a newsprint edition that came out as well in an edition of 100. Then in 2017, an expanded edition came out in edition of 150 through the Center of Craft in Asheville, North Carolina. And it essentially looked the same as artist book. It looked just like that. So this book takes the form of a skeuomorph, or it really leans into this term skeuomorph, which is a newer word, if you haven't heard it. So this is an object or feature which imitates the design of a similar artifact made from another material. And it's an element of a graphical user interface which mimics a physical object. So this is a lot of what we see in digital interfacing. I'll explain more in a minute. So in Writing in Threads, oh, this is an example of a skeuomorph though, which is Writing in Threads. The very title of the book is a skeuomorph. So these were actually all of, or not all of, but a great number of the sort of threads of emails that I wrote in order to start this project, because I was really in isolation in Connecticut at the Albers Foundation, seeing very few people, yet embarking on this deeply collaborative project. So much of what the form in which the project took place was text message threads and email threads, hence the name. So in Weaving Language 3, Writing in Threads, 15 writers are brought together into conversation with hand-loomed woven fabrics. During the summer of 2014, while in residence at the Joseph and Ani Albers Foundation, I wove 15 cloths on a Dorset loom. My process was determined primarily by listening to the dictation of the materials, a method I learned from the writings of Ani Albers. Each weaving was designed on the loom in response to particular materials through a variety of interlacing techniques that I set out to experiment with, as outlined in Weaving Language 1 Lexicon. So I was trying to get a breadth of responses that sort of exercised the lexicon. The cloths were all woven in a stream of consciousness style, though sometimes the motion of the streams moved both forward and back. And at one point I unwove over 4 inches of a very fine thread, which took several hours to build, and then moved forward with a slight modification in the design. So I just loved this idea that sort of a poetic structure could move forward and back through action. As each weaving came off the loom, it was subsequently matched to a writer whom I thought it might speak to. And each writer was sent a package in the mail, including the draft notation for a particular weaving. So this is the invitation, I'll just pause myself. This was the invitation that I wrote an email to the poets. So this started the thread. But then I sent a message in the mail, which included the draft notation for a particular weaving, a photo of the weaving front and back, small windings of the yarns used so that they could sort of engage with the threads, the Weaving Language 1 Lexicon, the draft of the book so that they could use it, and a short note including an invitation to respond. So here, writing in Threads takes on meaning beyond metaphor. Weaving is recognized as an alternative analog equivalent to digital writing forms, and notions of communication that might occur between a stitching circle and a community of writers are collapsed as epistolary relationships are formed that intermingle cloth and word. Writing in Threads is the most contemporary epistolary practice. Perhaps the thread is simply a metaphor for the passing back and forth of information and the through line that connects the sequence of gestures. The traces of writing that are embedded in the English language, specifically with the word text, derived from textus in Latin meaning cloth, have contemporary echoes of fiber-based languages in textile inscription, which are sparse in our translation into digital forms, save for the thread. As paperless culture becomes ubiquitous, the thread has taken hold in numerous platforms. Gmail organizes emails into threads, and so do most cell phone text messaging softwares. And here's the bit about skeuomorphs. We compile threads of instant messages, Twitter feeds, Facebook messages, and so on. We can even start a new thread if we choose to. The thread as a digital messaging structure is inclusive and multivocal, while also maintaining linearity through time and content. Makers of skeuomorphic terminology and information architecture have created a verbal and visual framework that takes cues from a variety of tools and processes in the physical world. Interface design aspects and actions involved in digital reading and writing, such as scrolling, emailing, posting, documents, folders, ebooks, stickies, they're all the skeuomorphs. Adopt a cross-section of physical objects and processes that are primarily related to the material and print culture that preceded the internet. The thread, however, references textile traditions of storytelling and record keeping that are primarily overlooked in conventional representations of the history of writing, despite their importance in having preceded traditional writing forms for thousands of years. Considering this context, Writing in Threads addresses a gap that exists between our cultural embrace of the thread and the historic fiber-based languages that inherently references. So through these correspondences, Weaving Language Lexicon came to life. And this is something that I really thought about while working on this project, and over the years working on this project, is that language, I invented the Weaving Language Lexicon sort of in isolation. Of course, it was influenced by Emmett Williams and Ani Albers, but I really thought about it on my own. But it didn't really become a language, in my opinion, until it existed between myself and this community of writers, because language is really a space that's shared between people or living things. And so it was really exciting to sort of pass this language over to a community and see how they adopted it. So this was Mairead Byrne, who's a dear friend and was a former college professor at RISD. And she took this weaving and translated it into this multi-stanza poem, which I thought was perfect. Just looking at the form of the weaving, it sort of exists within this almost stanza-like structure. And you can see that the front and the back of the weaving were displayed in the book. This was Kevin Killian, who sadly has passed in the past year. And he took this silver mylar weaving and translated it into, was inspired by Kylie Minogue. He often used pop culture references in his work, and translated it into this poem about Kylie Minogue, which I also really loved. Each poet sort of took a different approach in how they translated it and made it very inherent to their practice. So all of a sudden there were almost different accents for how Weaving Language Lexicon came to life, which was entirely based on each individual that engaged with it. This was Ian Hatcher. He's another artist. He works very much in coding and in written language, which was important to me because original languages of textile are really codes, these woven drafts. This was our correspondence. And then his layout in the book. And then this is him reading in 2016. We had a reading at Printed Matter to launch this publication, and this was Ian's reading. Ian Hatcher and Ben Fama and Sophia Lafraga were two artists who decided to take their two weavings and combine them into one poem. So they created a collaborative poem, and this was them also reading at that same event. So later that year, each of these weavings and poems were displayed at 99 Cent Plus Gallery in Brooklyn, now known as Fisher Parish Gallery, which has since closed. Lots of time has passed since this part of the project. So this was each of the weavings sort of displayed, and they each have a shelf underneath them with the poem displayed on a booklet, so that you could pick up the poem. It's sort of attached, the the booklet itself is bound with the threads that are in the weaving, and you could engage both a readerly experience and a viewer's experience at the same time. So that was sort of something that was really important to me in displaying these weavings, was that the viewer was also a reader. And actually one of these is now on display at National in their back room in Portland, Oregon, if you're interested to see it, and if you're local. So the last book in the presentation is Languages, Image, Paper, Code, and Cloth. And this was published in 2015 in the Artist Book edition of 5. And then it was also published by Information as Material in York, UK in 2018 in an edition of 500. So this book is comprised of essays, woven images, and poems. And the first part is an essay by the same title in the form of a timeline and is primarily composed of quotations. So I'll take you through some of that essay in a visual way as well. Languages, Image, Paper, Code, and Cloth takes an international approach at restructuring the history of writing with a focus on material processes, specifically ones that are textile based, making an argument for textile as a significant foundation for our early writing systems, and one that is often disregarded. The second part, entitled Woven Codes, is a series of poetic approaches at coding, writing into weaving, comparing the structure of various written forms to that of woven forms. The third and final part, Weaving Writing, is a short collection of poems which I have translated, both my own weavings and the weavings of others, through the use of Weaving Language 1 Lexicon. So this book really came about while studying. This book was expanded upon tremendously during my MFA at Brown in 2013 through 15. And I was 100% focused on studying this topic for that period of time, and just noticed that I was also studying typography and was learning about the early language forms and how language sort of developed, and many languages too. And I just never found that textile was acknowledged in much of these histories. And so felt like there was really a gap in which a lot of the work and the research that I was doing, it all sort of existed disparately. And I just wanted to collect it and have it exist as a single reference form for those who were interested in it, and for myself. So this was really something that I felt a project that I wanted to contribute to sort of the academic canon and to the research of other artists and writers interested in the topic, and bring it relevancy, because it is so, I think, deeply relevant. So this book takes the form of a cento, which is another poetic form. And like I said, each book sort of has its own form that it is inspired by. And so a cento is a poem that contains individual lines from other poems, and is really anything composed of incongruous parts, or a conglomeration or a patchwork. So really a cento is the written form of a quilt or a textile. It's a poetic form that is entirely, I think, inspired by textile. This is the introduction to Weaving Language 2. So this book, as I said, it's a cento. So all of the text in black is collected text, and each of the books that it's collected from, you can see in light gray. And then in blue is my original writing. So I'll just read a short portion of this. Languages, Image, Paper, Code, and Cloth. A spliced rope. Numerous cords integrally connected to one another, forming invisible and almost seamless connections. Materials are gathered, spun into a line that can be followed, read, touched, and understood. Drawing a thread around a sphere, as it spins, pinning it down, developments in recorded language. A textural mapping, a simultaneous and imperfect timeline/knot. Nomad, weaver, gathering, utterance emitted. Farmer, weaver, reaping. Notation recorded. No, not, node, note, notation. Read, thread, stitch, stitch, script. Song, harp, warp, word. So in doing this research, I noticed that so many of the words that describe communicating and weaving, verbal communication and written communication, that they all have these sort of poetics that exist around them, which I found to be very inspiring. and sort of harkens back to textile as this early writing system that has thus influenced the writing systems that we've known over time and today. So now I'll take you through the content in the book, which catalogs these instances of textile languages. So historically, writing and weaving share centuries of common ground stretching around the globe. Etymological traces of the connection between weaving and writing are evident in numerous languages and cultures. And this relationship stems from a fundamental sameness in their origins, which is the materiality of recorded language. So on this slide, you can see in Latin textum, which I mentioned before, and I think many people are familiar with, which means in Latin woven fabric or web, contexture, to weave together or connect, but also in Greek, Sanskrit, Mayan, Farsi, and I'm sure many other languages, which I'm yet to discover, these words that acknowledge writing and textile making and also other forms of material creation are all compiled together and have overlap in meaning. So in Greek, the word techne refers to art, craft, and skill. So a weaver not only fashions textiles, but with the same verb can contrive texts. In Sanskrit, sutra, meaning thread, is a book formed of sutras, as a fabric is formed of threads. In Mayan, Sib is used to refer to writing, but also figures, designs, and diagrams in general, whether they be drawn, painted, engraved, embroidered, or woven. And in Farsi, tiraz forms a verb in Persian that means to weave, to adorn, or to compose poetry. And as a verb stem, it also includes in compounds such as sukyan tiraz, which means word weaving or eloquent, used to describe poets. And in Persian textiles, the straight stitch bakya is a parallel to the shared tradition of songs learned and repeated. So there's also this notion of repeat, which happens in textile and then also happens in poetry. So lots of poetics to sort of be discovered amongst language in this space. So the use of weaving as a means for recording the human experience dates back thousands of years and is placed squarely amongst many other forms and materials for communication that predate the earliest formal writing systems, such as hieroglyphics and cuneiform. So you can see that the evidence of weaving is happening sort of simultaneously with cave paintings and petroglyphs, and that the first artifact of weaving is discovered many, many years before the earliest writing systems. Due to the decomposable nature of the materials that our earliest textiles were made of, we lack evidence of them until after the development of clay pottery. Some of the earliest artifacts of weaving are found as impressions of clay fragments dating back to 25,000 BCE, but the earliest known actual fragment dates back to 7,000 BCE. So it's entirely possible that as these petroglyphs and cave paintings, as these are developing, so were woven languages, but we just simply don't have records of them because they were decomposable. But I always wonder when looking at this image, was there something inscribed on these cloths or in these cloths that we can't see? Yeah, there's just a lot of mystery there, I think. So Boustrophedon was a written form named after the turning of the ox in plowing, and it dates back to the 5th century BCE. It was used in ancient scripts such as Safaetic and Sabian, and eventually cuneiform in Greek. Resembling that of a weft moving back and forth as the text approaches the margin on a horizontal trajectory, it rounds the edge and turns upside down and continues on as so. And so I wonder, was this form referencing weaving? And is that something that perhaps is also not acknowledged? It's a form that I often use as inspired by this inquiry. I often use it in my work. So this is an example of papyrus remnants of a text by Sappho from Lesbos, Greece in 600 BCE. But papyrus was discovered or invented around 3000 BCE, and it was a material created as a substrate for writing by organizing vertical and horizontal reeds and pounding them together into a single surface. So how was this idea of vertical and horizontal reeds as a sort of strong structure something that was considered, again, the woven cloth as a substrate for writing? So, and followed this was the development of the scroll form and the invention of the ink-filled pen, But I like to note here that just that horizontal and vertical combination is really the early beginnings of paper and substrate as for writing in the way that we know it today. So in 200 BCE, the Anatolian Kalim is the expression of a tradition dating back around 9,000 years, a tradition that has been maintained by women without a break for hundreds of generations to the Neolithic era. The art of weaving the Kalim was transmitted orally from mother to daughter in keeping with a symbolic tradition that was unconscious but powerful and active. So this is 2000 BCE and dates far back. And so I love this idea because it was really a multi-generational language, something that exists through a maternal line and also through a visual thread line. In 200 BCE, we have silk manuscripts from Hunan, China. And this is the Mawangui silk texts, which had Chinese and philosophical and medical writing recorded on silk. And I'll just note that this substrate for writing didn't exist or didn't go on for very long because it was very expensive. And the Chinese were some of the first inventors of paper, and it's sort of argued within texts, but it's sort of happening simultaneously in Europe and in China, where paper is being invented. So I'm excited to share this particular reference with Annen's class. So this is from 1070 CE, the Bayou Tapestry. And it was created within a generation of the Battle of Hastings and is one of the most famous wall hangings and precious objects that survived the Middle Ages. So it's essentially a visual, embroidered and semi-textual representation of the Battle of Hastings that's enormously long and exists in this museum space under very dim lights for preservation in England, which anyone can go visit. It's in a museum. Arabic inscriptions can be found in Tiraz textiles dating back to the 11th century AD. And typically these are found on turbans or robes used for ceremonies given by the caliph. The messages have been translated to discover this particular sequence: a blessing, where the fabric was made, and the name of the caliph and the date. So these are found in Iran, Pakistan, Egypt, and the Balkans. And what I see here is so similar to the tags that we have in our clothing. So really, it's a political document and a textile at the same time. And this practice is still very real today. Any sort of producer of a textile-based product that is mass-produced is required by law, by the government, to post in a woven tag or a printed tag the country of origin and the fiber content. It just seems like a parallel that exists in a very similar way. And so I love that idea that this political document exists in textile. So in West Africa, the various geometric kente cloth patterns represent specific meanings that were stitched in combination to express traditional and proverbial narratives. The colors also have specific implications, so I'll just share a few. Red means political and spiritual moods, bloodshed, sacrificial rites, and death. Pink is the female essence of life, a mild and gentle aspect of red. Yellow is preciousness, royalty, wealth, fertility, and beauty. Green is vegetation, planting, harvesting, growth, and spiritual renewal. Blue is peacefulness, harmony, and love. And I'll pause there, but I'll just say that this very notion of color having a meaning in a textile really inspired so much of my thinking for the lexicon and how color is translated there. And something I'll note is perhaps in most of the references that I've shared to date, it's the textile language has been primarily created by women. However, in West Africa, it's unique that they are traditionally created by men. So this takes us now to Europe. So weaving is almost always an attribute of female characters in Greek literature, much as armor or weaponry is the attribute of males. And when we first encounter the radiant Helen in the Iliad, she is wearing a growing web, a dark folding robe, working into the weft, the endless bloody struggles, stallion breaking Trojans and Argives Argives armed in bronze, had suffered all for her at the god of battle's hands. Helen's red web symbolically reproduces the web of violence her beauty has unleashed upon the world. And in general, like arms, weaving is not a simple emblem of domestic order and harmony. It can be a weapon in its own right, through which women are able to achieve their ends. Weaving and unweaving famously emblematizes the means through which faithful Penelope, the crafty and exemplary wife, keeps her suitors at bay while her husband makes his zigzag way home in the Odyssey. So this takes us to sort of ancient Rome and Greece. So since 1400 CE, the quipu in Peru is an amazing reference, and also one that Cecilia Vacuna has referenced heavily in her work and researched heavily. So the Inca spoke Quechua, but their only recorded language discovered to date was a system of knotted chords called quipu. And anthropologists have gleaned that this system was used for counting and various economic records, and some hypothesize it was used for poetry and narrative. So as you can see, it's sort of like an abacus. So where there's one wrap in a knot, it means one, and then two wraps means two, and so on and so forth. But then there's all these other complex knots that I think are still being translated. There's not a ton of these that exist in translated form. It's more in still the research stages, but they're phenomenal because they survived the conquistadores, and there's very few of them left in the world. I think there's about 600 of them. But as you can see, also there's this horizontal line that organizes the thread, and then all these vertical lines in which each thread is perhaps a disparate thought that connects in sequence. So the sequential nature of it, I think, is really interesting and connects back to written language, I think, in a really direct way. So the Artabil Carpet is one of the most famous historical Persian textiles from around 1539. Measuring 38 by 18 feet, the carpet bears this inscription by the weaver: "I have no refuge in this world other than thy threshold. There is no protection for my head other than this door, the work of the slave of the threshold, Maskud of Kashan, in the year 946, which is a date referencing their specific calendar system, which in the Christian calendar is 1539. So you can see that the placement of that text sort of exists within a threshold at this top, almost doorway of the weaving, which is also really beautiful. And the Arabic inscription itself very much looks like the patterns that are surrounding it, which is also, I think, very beautiful. So this takes us to Papua New Guinea. Among the people of Kendinji on the Middle Sepik River, the most important man in every group keeps a knotted cord some 6 to 8 meters long and 3 centimeters thick, which is said to represent the primal migration in which the founder of the clan, following in the path of the crocodile, journeyed from place to place. Each large knot in the cord, into which a woven dried betel nutshell is embedded, represents a primal place, while the smaller knots preceding it stand for the secret names of the totem dwellings in that place. In important ceremonies, the owner of the cord lets it run through his fingers, rather as though he were handling a rosary, singing each place and its associated totems. Thus, the movement of slipping the cord through the fingers corresponds to the movement of the clan founder as he journeyed from one settlement to the next. So now we're coming closer to the present day. In 1801, Joseph Marie Jacquard invented the Jacquard loom in Lyon, France. And the first Jacquard loom was based on earlier designs by Basile Bouchon and Jean-Baptiste Falcon, utilizing a Jacquard head that attached to the loom containing a punch card system, similar to what I was weaving in that first video, which controls the lifting of the harnesses. This punched hole system is the precursor of zeros and ones in computing technology. So that's like yet another poetic connection between language or contemporary language and weaving, is this idea that so much of what the language we're creating today exists in a digital space and is determined by zeros and ones, and so is textile in this case. So this is one of my favorite references. In 16th to 19th century North America, training in embroidery and needlepoint samplers were part of a privileged woman's education, long before women were taught writing and penmanship. This naturally bred subversion, and an excellent example is this embroidered diary entry by Elizabeth Parker from 1830, which is now in the collection at the Victoria and Albert Collection Museum. So there's so much here that I could talk about, but I'll only talk about a few things. One is she embroiders, "As I cannot write, I put this down." I think just acknowledging here that women perhaps felt that they couldn't write, they weren't trained to write, it wasn't part of their education. So she feels that she can't write, so she's embroidering, but clearly she has a story, she has something to say, she has thoughts, and needs to express them in the written form. And textile is the closest, and embroidery is the closest form that she has to express herself. And so she does so. The other thing that I want to mention is just her choice to embroider this in red thread. It is a painful tale of her hardships as a woman in this time of in the world. And she experiences abuse, and she has suicidal thoughts, and she just really goes through lots of trials and tribulations throughout this story, which is, if you want to take a closer look, is on the Victoria and Albert Museum website. But the last few lines are what will become of my soul. So you can just imagine how desperate she was to express herself in written form, and how embroidery was the closest thing that she has to that. So I think a lot of the kind of common perception of embroidery, and perhaps women's messages in embroidery, are not always necessarily so deep. And so I think this is a wonderful reminder of probably what is one of many textiles that might have had deeper stories embroidered onto them that perhaps are less commonly seen. This one's a little lighter, but this is more written in a woven form for economical purposes, from mid-19th century North America. A cross-written letter is what it was called, and it was used to conserve paper during wartime when supplies were sparse. So not really lighter, but because it's during wartime, but the content, I can't actually read it, so I couldn't tell you what it says. So these are the last few slides. Thank you for sitting through that historical part. And I'll just note that if you couldn't tell, I was reading, most of what I read is not my writing. It was all this collected information that exists in the book, which you can find there. So woven codes, this was the last part of this book, and there were a few explorations into different kind of codes that I invented based on just kind of seeing opportunities for poetics between writing and textile. So here I used erasure, so taking Gertrude Stein's tender buttons, and then I grid them out, and then I erase them, and through that erasure there's a woven draft takes place. So in black is where the warp is lifted, and in white is where the weft is lifted. So here you can see that process in action. The poem itself from Gertrude Stein, then the gridding out, then the erasure, and the erasure becomes the woven draft. And then you can see what a speculative version of what those cloths would look like. And I love the way these cloths look, because they seem very true to Gertrude Stein. They're sort of wild, and maybe look like they would even fall apart, which I think is a way in which she almost used language as well. So that seemed appropriate for her woven translation. Then this one takes poetic rhyme schemes. So I think part of what influenced weaving language as well was learning jacquard in school, and also learning traditional poetic structures at the same time, and understanding this idea of the repeat. And so here I take the two and collapse them. So this is a Shakespearean sonnet, which you see it's A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. and visualizes it in color and then weaves it. And the most interesting part of this process for me was just seeing the back and seeing how those sort of poetic forms loop around and how. And so here you can see it's like very smooth. In the sestina, this one I learned about the sestina from Jen Bourbon. She works with this form as well. But I love the way the back of the sestina looks, where it sort of loops around in an even way, but intertangles as it loops, and then becomes a bit chaotic at the end as everything lumps together, and that's sestina form. And then this is a Pantoum, which is used by John Ashbery. And in this one, you can see it just loops around in one big U form. So just learn something about poetic structure here through weaving it that I otherwise wouldn't have seen. So in 2018, we did a launch for Weaving Language 2 at MoMA PS1 during the New York Art Book Fair. And I invited a group of artists to sort of take each section of the book and respond to it. And as I mentioned before, this work very much involves community to sort of bring this idea of weaving language to life in contemporary practice. And so the artist Audra Wolowiak took this sestina by Dante and translated it into a chorus.
And alone away the thought halls of granite, because she weaves, that is precious, so well that not be healed, a star over the shut shade, so dim, faster than between nothing can give, she is more bright, nor wall, nor summer to give, I saw her therefore have fled, she might have taken refuge from, even
and then also in the book are translations of weavings by other artists whom I admire, where I took the weaving that they created and translated it using the lexicon. So this is by Ruth Lasky, and I'll just read a few lines. You fall with exaltation, falling vector, fall of hesitation, you tangent bloom, awoke as you were, falling sun, falling star, falling into abrupt hazard, you incessant, incandescent, you are eager, you flashlight, you circuit, you beehive, you are falling. This one is by Alicia Scardetta, and I translated her weaving. As you can see, the sort of form of the weaving informs the form of the writing. And this one is by New Friends. So as I mentioned, I really like to include the community who's interested on the work. And so thank you all for being here. And so I will leave you all with this prompt. So this invites you to use Textile as a prompt and consider it something that can be read and responded to. And so think of your task as weaving language in some way, and take one of these prompts that I've shared with you and a textile of your choosing to be a guide to unlock a new approach in thinking and writing. So find a textile in your own home, or perhaps one that you make, and I invite you to use one of these systems of translation and experiment with it. And this is an opportunity to work ekphrastically. So ekphrastic is sort of a visual poem, or something that writing that takes a visual form. How can you translate or map the image into written form, and use this experiment in a way that makes sense for you? Let the rules be a structure to help you branch out and experiment, but not to bind you. And you could also work in collaboration. So work with a group, and each person creates a short piece of woven language, and you can collaborate by patching them together into a cento. So that is the end. Thank you all very much for listening. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Great, thank you, Francesca. You really made us think. Ooh. There's a question here from Gigi. Do you ever translate text into weaving?
Text into weaving. Yes, I mean, I think the Gertrude Stein example is one way of doing that. The poetic structures was another way, but it's an endless exploration. So I think there's many ways to explore that. for sure.
There's another question from Teresa Castro saying, thanks so much for this inspiring presentation. A question, why do you think textiles were disregarded as an early writing system? It's interesting to think that women were already expressing their narratives way before written language appeared.
I think you might have answered that yourself. Unfortunately, I think women's work has been just disregarded for centuries, and I strongly believe that that's why it hasn't been considered, unfortunately. But I think it's very much being investigated now, which is really exciting. I think both in feminist communities and in queer communities as a significant form that's been overlooked for a long time, and in marginalized and indigenous communities as well. Yeah.
A question from Bennett. English has so many language words with textile connections. How true is that in other languages? And is there a different feel for the connections in cultures with different textile traditions, such as felt?
That's a great one. I've discovered, I mean, this is something I researched, but I think there's endless information because so much of it exists in different disparate places that I'd be interested in reading a book that just explored that question. But so far, I noticed the Mayan, the Farsi, and the Greek and the Latin, and also the Hindu. But where those words are sort of connected and involve poetics, but I'm sure that there's more. And I think due to the roots of how language came about through materials, I'm positive that it must exist in many languages over many continents, because it's really the roots in which written language came to be. Mm-hmm. But a lot to be learned there. I think I know about this much. I think part of studying this overlapping forms involves being sort of not an expert in anything and just only learning a little bit from lots of different places and collecting them together. Thank you for those questions. They're great questions.
Sophia mentions in Spanish, trauma means plot, T-R-A-M-A, trauma means plot, and it also means weft.
Incredible.
That's great.
I think a crowdsourcing is necessary to pull together all this information. That perhaps is an interesting project unto itself.
A question from Lily. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, very inspiring. Do you see your work as political at all? I think both modern weaving and poetry can be inherently subversive. Essentially what I'm trying to say is, do you view your practice as embracing tradition or subverting it? Lots of love from England, from Lily.
Thank you, Lily. I do see it as political work, and because I do think that it's sort of uncovering and acknowledging the work of marginalized people, and establishing it, or crediting it rather, not establishing it, it's already been established, crediting it as something totally legitimate and influential over so much of the shape that writing has taken today. So I think it's difficult to work in this way or around this topic without it feeling political, for sure. That's a great observation.
Lily, thanks you for your wonderful answer. Are there, and Kim McCollum asks, are there contemporary artists or thinkers that work in this area that you would recommend looking at? And they have lots of friends that have borrowed Kim's Weaving Language book 2, Weaving Language number 2. And always make sure to stress how important it is that they return it. And another related question was, is there any way to access your writing online digitally?
First, wait, can you repeat the first
Sorry.
question?
So the first one is, are there contemporary artists or thinkers that work in this area that you'd recommend?
Yes, of course. I mentioned a few at the beginning, which I'll mention again. Ani Albers, who referenced pre-Columbian weaving, and she often says that the pre-Columbian weavers were her teachers, and so I think her work unto itself, but then also the work that inspired her of the pre-Columbian weavers, I think is a great place to look. And then Cecilia Vacuna, who just had a show recently at the Henry in Seattle. And she does a lot of research into quipu and textiles from South America, and also creates contemporary work around it, and is a writer and a weaver. And Ani Albers, also a writer and a weaver. And then Jen Bervin, who's an artist that I had the fortune of being studio assistant to for a while, and is a big influence and a mentor. And she creates really wonderful work around text and textile that is research-based as well. So learning or studying her work brings you into many other artists, and also sort of unacknowledged creators of textile and text-based work together. So those are three of my favorite artists, but there are many more that, yeah, I won't list now. And then in terms of where to find my work, that's something that I'm actively trying to get out. So in 2021, as I mentioned, this new edition of Weaving Language Lexicon will be published, so before the end of the year. And then I'm also working on sort of a compilation of all of the books together, so that they can be sort of experienced as a collection and mass produced. So I'm working on that too. But the books do exist within some museum collections and library collections. So that can be borrowed through the interlibrary system. And perhaps if PSU doesn't have any in their library, I would happily make a donation to PSU of the books. But they're mostly out of print, unfortunately, at this moment, because they haven't really been produced in that big of a way. As I mentioned, there's like 500 copies here, 150 copies there. So working on it.
One of the things I really appreciate about having this book is the way that you have back pages representing the reverse side of a cloth. I've never seen that in a publication before, and it's genius, I think. It just shows the importance of that in textile being a three-dimensional structure. And I'm just curious if you'd say a little bit more. You touched on it when you were talking about the New Guinea textile as a map, almost, or a representation of place or space. And that's such an intriguing notion. I wonder if you had anything more to say about that, just textiles as a marker or a documentation of space.
That's an area of inquiry that I'm fascinated by as well. I love that question, Anand. I have a few projects, I think, that have acknowledged that, and just totally agree with you. I had a project from 2017 or 18 called Think of Seashells, where I collected artifacts and objects from places, and then wove them on site into small textiles, small weavings, and created a book and document out of that called Woven Places. So that was sort of one area of inquiry that I used directly. But then just any textile is, a mark of time and space. So many of what the textiles that I referenced in the presentation, the threads that they're created out of, for instance, the papyrus, the materials that's made out of very much is representative of what materials were available at that time, what technology was available to combine them or create an object. It's and oftentimes the colors that are used represent what's available during that time. it's very much a documentation of time and space. So even if the textile doesn't have writing embedded into it in some kind of an overt way, meaning and historical documentation and relevance is inherently embedded, for sure. That's, I think, fascinating.
As you talk about textiles as a code also, it's always occurred that, you can see the X and Y coordinates of time and space.
I never thought of it like that.
Being translated into textile. I don't know.
I love that idea.
Yeah. Well, seems, yeah, congruent with yours. There's a question here. How does your artwork and research around a very tactile process inform your work in industry, which the person imagines is heavily dominated by digital processes?
Wait, what was, I have to look at this.
So how does the artwork and research?
I mean,
yeah.
yeah. Sorry, I just pulled them to chat so I could see it myself. Everything, no matter how something is how digital the process is in designing something, what I've learned from my practice as a professional materials designer is that at the end of the day, a human being makes that thing with their hands. There's surely a machine involved in the process, but in traveling, to many different countries and seeing the weaving processes happening, even if you're in a mass production factory, if somebody has to thread that loom. There's no digital process for taking a thread and threading it through the loom. A person does that. And I think that is something that is so amazing about woven cloth in particular, is that it's so connected to humanity and to people. There's just no way to create that object without a person. So yeah, I think that's how it, like, I'm very much inspired by seeing all the different processes in industry in which textiles are made, and like the scale at which they're made. And it's fascinating to me how similar it is just to the simplicity of weaving on one's own frame loom, for instance. Not much changes. You still need a person to thread it. It makes me appreciate textile very much so. Good. Those are such wonderful questions. I feel inspired.
Yeah, they are good.
Can I ask a question? I was trying to formulate this in writing, and I didn't know how, and I think that also speaks to sometimes how challenging it can be to materialize a thought in words. And I'm curious how you sort of think about that with textiles, because the process of materializing thought and word is so different than weaving and materializing through thread. And I often find that sewing or weaving can be a kind of non-thinking space. And I'm just curious how you think about that when you approach a piece of text or a piece of cloth, and how you sort of think about abstraction in your work.
Sure, thank you, Nora. I think that's something that I very much credit to. I totally understand the question and what you mean by that. That's I think it's very intuitive, the response to thread and to color and visual and tactile things together. I think Ani Albers says it best. Listening to the materials and doing what the materials tell you to do. I've started so many projects with unusual materials where they just don't want to do certain things and they really want to do others. So I think that that informs my process very much so, is like just looking at something and feeling it and sitting with it and thinking about what it wants to do and trying to bring that to life. I just made a weaving for my partner, which was when we got married, we tied a knot together, and we're 3 years married now, and I've had this knot and this thread sitting on it, not knowing what to do with it, looking at it. And really recently I came up with, it just came to me, that's the composition that it should go into, and this is what it should look like. And I think also time has to do with it. I like the Annan X and Y axis idea. A certain amount of time sometimes has to pass with sitting with a material before you can kind of think about how to use it or how to respond to it. I feel the same way with books. You can have a book on your shelf for many years, open it up, try and read it, not connect to it, but then the time in your life in which it's relevant, all of a sudden you read it in 2 days. Yeah, I don't know how good of an answer to your question that is, but.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks. And Carolina, you had a question, if you wanted to ask that directly.
Yes, thank you. So I asked a question in the chat, and then another thing that is not really a question, just something I wanted to share with you. So I'll just share that thing first. So I work at a conservation lab, and recently they it's a personal piece, but someone brought in a like textile where they're like, I'm not sure the connection to the family, but basically on the textile they're writing like a secret code. But basically telling them that they weren't going to return. So they were leaving Germany during World War II. And so in the embroidery, they're kind of like leaving a message to their family. And I thought that would be interesting because you mentioned Elizabeth Parker's. And I was like, oh, she probably thinks, because it's so interesting how, and this isn't the first case that I've seen of it. There's also a lot of textiles that will like leave codes in it for family members, especially during wartime. What was that?
I just said amazing.
Yes, I just thought that that'd be interesting for your own research. But so the question that I did ask though is that I think that you mentioned that you were compiling all this research and making maybe a book. And I was wondering if that's still in progress, because I would really love to read that.
Just want to respond to the first thing you said. It sounds like perhaps you have a book to make too, in collaboration with the conservation lab that you work at, because that just sounds like really incredible and fascinating textile documents. Yeah, what is the name of the lab?
Oh, it's in San Francisco. It has a long name, that's why I don't remember it.
Will you put it in the chat?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. I'm working on, so braiding. It takes time, I think, to establish oneself, to find the right publisher, to all of these things. A lot of my work has been self-published, or in collaboration with museum institutions or smaller presses. So I've sort of piecemealed my publications together in the way that I have, humbly. And so I do have a book coming out in 2021 that will take Weaving Language Lexicon, and I've assigned each portion of it to a different artist or small group of artists to create their own version of it. So that will be a bigger edition, hopefully edition of 500 or 1,000. So that's coming out by the end of this year. And then I hope to create a book that compiles them, all the work together, into one publication. But in terms of just readily accessing the work, it all exists within library collections, which I have documented on my website. So it's at the University of Chicago library. It's at the Met and the MoMA library. I have my full collection of books. And I believe a few more and so they can be borrowed through the interlibrary system, or if you happen to be in New York, you can visit them there. And I know that that's not the best answer, but it's the best I could do for now. It's a big priority for me to get my work into libraries so that it could be accessed easily.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina.
Are there any other questions? I know Annan has to get back to class. Her class also has to get to class. But yeah, I just wanted to take just one brief moment to kind of just give us some space. If there's any additional questions, please feel free to type them in the chat or unmute yourself. But otherwise, thank you so much, Franny, for joining us today and sharing your amazing work and your research with us. For those of you who are interested in continuing to follow Franny's work, I highly encourage you to check out her website, and I will post this in the chat. This conversation is going to be archived and available through our YouTube channel at the PSU Textile Arts YouTube channel. And I would also just encourage everybody to check out some of our upcoming events, including this next Wednesday, Gabe Duggan, who's going to be with us as a part of the digital weaving class, talking about analog and digital processes and how that informs their work.